Welcome back to Books and Bites. You know how this works. You guys send us the stuff you're reading, and we kind of pick it apart, pull out the good stuff.
That's right.
And this time we're taking on a classic. It's fascinating and honestly a little creepy. Gustave Le Bon's The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. We're diving into how our behavior changes when we're part of a group.
Yeah, and this book, it was published way back in 1895, but Le Bon's ideas about crowd psychology, they're still so relevant today. It's amazing.
I know, right?
And think about it, we're always in crowds these days, both physical and online. So understanding those dynamics, well, it can really be a game changer.
Okay, so let's get into it. Le Bon says that when we become part of a crowd, something happens to our brains. We literally become less ourselves and more like part of a hive mind.
Yeah, he called it submergence.
Yeah. And it explains why people who are normally rational can get swept up in crazy crowd behavior. Like, have you ever been on a concert or a huge sporting event?
Oh, yeah.
You get caught up in the energy and suddenly you're chanting along with thousands of strangers doing things you'd never do alone.
Absolutely. That's the crowd in action Le Bon called this contagion. The idea that emotions and behaviors can spread through a crowd like wildfire, almost like a virus.
Whoa.
And it's not just physical crowds either. We see it online all the time with viral trends and how information spreads, whether it's true or not.
So it's like our brains take a shortcut.
Yeah.
Our higher level thinking, the part that thinks things through and weighs the consequences, that takes a backseat to our gut reactions and emotions.
Right.
Okay, so if crowds are so easily swayed by emotion, what about leaders? What role do they play? Le Bon seemed convinced that leaders, or influencers as we might call them now, have huge power over crowds.
He thought that charismatic and decisive people, the ones who can tap into the crowd's emotions, they're the ones who can really control what the crowd does.
Like, think about those historical figures who have inspired massive movements.
Exactly. Le Bon pointed out that they often use simple emotional language repetition and strong imagery. They bypass logic and go straight for the heart. And that's why slogans chant symbols. They're so powerful. They get people moving.
It's not just rallies or protests, though, right? This happens in marketing, in politics, in social movements.
Oh, absolutely. Think about how much easier it is to get behind a clear, simple message than a long, complicated argument.
So there's a method to the madness.
For sure.
But is it all bad? Are crowds always a force for chaos?
Not necessarily. Le Bon recognized that crowds can also be a powerful force for good.
Okay.
Think about historical movements for social justice or acts of heroism during a disaster. In those cases, that same emotional contagion can inspire incredible acts of courage and selflessness.
So it's this double-edged sword.
It is.
This potential for good and bad. And it all depends on the influences at play, the leaders, the ideas, the emotions driving them.
Right.
Understanding crowd psychology seems to be about recognizing the risks, but also learning how to use that power for positive change. Le Bon even uses some compelling historical examples to show this, doesn't he?
Yeah, he dives into revolutions, religious fervor, even financial panics. He shows how crowds have been a decisive force in shaping major historical events.
And what's so interesting is that a lot of his observations from back then still hold true today.
I know.
That's what's so amazing about Le Bon's work. It helps us understand not just the past, but also what's happening right now, which leads to the big question, what does all of this mean for us in the 21st century, especially with social media everywhere? It's like Le Bon predicted the internet age, even though he was writing over 100 years ago.
It's pretty incredible, right? The principles he laid out about how crowds behave, they're even more relevant now with social media. Think about platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. They've created these massive online crowds where information and misinformation can spread in an instant.
It's like the contagion effect on steroids.
It really is. Suddenly you've got millions of people connected, sharing ideas, emotions, and opinions on a scale we've never seen before.
And that creates incredible opportunities, but also some serious challenges.
For sure.
On the one hand, social media can be a powerful tool for social change, for connecting people across borders, for giving a voice to those who haven't been heard.
Absolutely.
But on the other hand, it can also be a breeding ground for extremism, the spread of misinformation and mob mentality. It's a double-edged sword.
It really is, and it makes Le Bon's work even more important for us to understand.
I think so too. So we've got this contagion effect, this influence of leaders, and now this potential for both good and bad. It's a lot to unpack.
Definitely.
But it's clear that understanding how crowds work is crucial in today's world.
100%.
And it's not just about avoiding crowds, it's about understanding how they operate and learning to navigate them in a smart way.
Yeah, it's about using that knowledge to our advantage. You know, Le Bon didn't just focus on the negative stuff about crowds. He also acknowledged their potential for good. He talked about how crowds can show amazing selflessness and devotion to a cause.
Right. And we've seen that.
Powerful stuff.
It is. It really is. So we've got this incredible potential within crowds for both good and harm. And it all comes down to the influences at play, the leaders, the ideas, the emotions that are driving things.
I think that's a great way to put it.
So it's not about dismissing crowds altogether. It's about getting a handle on their complexities and nuances. Maybe even more importantly, it's about understanding how we as individuals can choose to participate in crowds in ways that align with our values and contribute to positive change.
Right. We're not just along for the ride.
We're active participants. We have a choice.
We do, and it's about recognizing that we all have the power to choose how we respond to the challenges and opportunities of this digital age. We're not just at the mercy of the crowd. We can shape the crowd for better or for worse.
I love that. That's a really hopeful and empowering message. And it brings us back to the core of Le Bon's work. Understand the psychology of crowds isn't just about recognizing the dangers, but also about harnessing the power of collective action for good.
Exactly, and in today's world, that understanding is more important than ever. Le Bon's work gives us a framework for navigating the complexities of human behavior, both individually and collectively.
This has been such an insightful conversation. I feel like we've covered so much ground, from the history of crowd psychology to the implications of social media and how we can apply Le Bon's insights to our own lives.
It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope our listeners have found it as thought-provoking as we have.
Me too. And in part 2, we'll continue our deep dive into the crowd and discuss some key takeaways for moving forward in a world that is increasingly shaped by crowd dynamics.
Sounds good. Welcome back to part 2 of our deep dive into the crowd.
All right, so before the break, we were talking about how relevant Le Bon's insights into crowd psychology are in today's digital age.
It's like he was a time traveler.
Right.
It's amazing how much his work from the 19th century still applies to what we see online today. One thing that really hit me while reading The Crowd was how Le Bon emphasized that crowds aren't necessarily driven by logic or reason.
Right, it's more about emotion.
Yeah, he basically said, forget those complex arguments. If you want to move a crowd, you got to appeal to their emotions.
So that's where the imagery and symbolism come in.
Exactly.
Le Bon believed that visual stuff, images, they trigger much stronger emotional responses than words alone.
It's true. Think about the power of a flag or a logo or even just a powerful photo. Those things can bypass our logical thinking and tap right into our gut feeling.
Like a shortcut of our emotions.
Yeah, and smart leaders and influencers, they've known this for centuries. Look at propaganda throughout history.
Ooh, that's a good point.
It often uses simple emotional images and slogans to get people on board or to make their opponents look bad.
And now with social media, we're bombarded with these kinds of images and messages all the time.
Constantly. It's like a never-ending battle for our attention and our emotions.
So how do we deal with that?
Well, that's where media literacy comes in. We need to be aware of the techniques that are being used to influence us and to be critical of the information we're taking in. We got to make sure we're not just reacting emotionally, but really thinking things through.
It's like we need to be more mindful.
Exactly.
So it's not just about avoiding crowds altogether. It's more about being aware of how they work and using that knowledge to our advantage.
Right.
We talked about groupthink earlier, but are there other strategies we can use to stay grounded in our own thinking? How do we avoid getting swept away by the crowd?
Well, Le Bon was a big believer in knowledge as a defense mechanism. The more you understand how crowds work, the better equipped you are to resist manipulation and to make your own choices.
Like having a shield.
Exactly. It's not about being scared of crowds. It's about understanding them and then using that understanding to make smart decisions.
And it's important to remember that Le Bon didn't just focus on the negative side of crowds. He also recognized that they could be a force for good.
Right.
He talked about how crowds can be incredibly selfless and devoted to a cause.
Absolutely. Think about those times when people come together to fight for social justice, or when they rush to help each other after a natural disaster.
Yeah, there's real power in that.
It's amazing to see.
It is. So we've got this kind of duality.
Right.
This potential for both incredible good and incredible harm. And it all hinges on the influences at play. The leaders, the ideas, the emotions that are driving things.
You hit the nail on the head.
Okay, so it's not about writing off crowds entirely. It's more about grasping their complexities and their nuances, and maybe even more importantly, it's about understanding how we as individuals can choose to be part of crowds in ways that are positive and that align with our values.
It's about making conscious choices.
Exactly. We're not just passive observers. We can actually shape the direction of the crowd.
We can, and that's what makes Le Bon's work so relevant to our lives today. It helps us understand not only the grand historical movements, but also the everyday situations where we encounter group dynamics.
So, like what kinds of situations? Give us an example.
Sure. Think about a team meeting at work or how online communities form around a certain issue or idea. Those are all crowds, in a sense.
Okay, so how do we use Le Bon's insights to navigate those more everyday situations?
Well, one of the biggest takeaways is to be aware of social influence. It's something that affects all of us, whether we realize it or not.
So we should be more mindful of how the groups we belong to might be shaping our thoughts and actions.
Exactly, and we should watch out for groupthink. That's when a group makes decisions without really considering all the options or the potential consequences, often because people are afraid to speak up or disagree.
Oh, I've definitely seen that happen.
It's super common.
And it can be so subtle.
It can, but Le Bon's work can help us understand why it happens and how to avoid it. By recognizing the patterns, asking critical questions, and being willing to share our own perspectives, we can help make sure group decisions are more thoughtful and well considered.
Okay, so be aware of social influence and watch out for groupthink. Got it. What else can we take away from Le Bon's work that we can use in our daily lives?
Another important thing is to be critical of the messages we're exposed to, especially with all the stuff flying around on social media. It's easy to get caught up in the hype or to believe something just because everyone else seems to be buying it.
Right, so don't just blindly follow the crowd, question things.
Exactly. Do your own research. Be willing to think for yourself, even if it means going against the grain. It's about being an informed and engaged person, both online and in the real world.
I like that. It's about taking responsibility for our own thinking and our own actions, and recognizing that we all have a role to play in shaping the direction of the crowd.
That's right. We're not just passive observers, we're active participants.
We have the power to choose.
We do, and it's about recognizing that we have the power to choose how we respond to the challenges and the opportunities of this digital age. We're not just at the mercy of the crowd, we can actually shape the crowd, for better or for worse.
That's a really empowering message. And it brings us back to the heart of Le Bon's work. Understanding crowd psychology isn't just about seeing the dangers. It's also about harnessing the power of collective action for good.
Exactly, and that's why Le Bon's work is more important now than ever. It gives us a framework for navigating the complexities of human behavior, both individually and as part of a group.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation. I feel like we've covered so much, from the history of crowd psychology to the impact of social media, and how we can apply Le Bon's insights to our own lives.
We've spent some time unpacking how crowds can influence individuals, the power of those leaders and influencers, and even the dangers of groupthink. But as we wrap up, I'm curious, what really jumped out at you from Le Bon's work? What resonated?
You know, one of the things that struck me most is how Le Bon really hammered home the importance of understanding crowd psychology. He argued that knowledge is power. And by really grasping the mechanisms at play, we can be more discerning, less susceptible to manipulation, and we can navigate our interactions with crowds more effectively, whether they're large or small. It's not about being afraid of crowds. It's about equipping ourselves with the knowledge to maneuver through them in a smart way. It's recognizing that we're not just passively being swept along. We have agency. We can choose how we participate, how we respond, even how we influence the crowd ourselves. And it's wild to think Le Bon was writing in the late 19th century, yet his work feels incredibly relevant to us today, especially with the whole social media landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. The rise of social media has basically created this global crowd where information, emotions, opinions, everything's spreading at lightning speed. It's like a perfect breeding ground for the kind of contagion and suggestibility that Le Bon was talking about.
It's true. It's like we're constantly navigating this massive interconnected web of influences. So how do we stay grounded in all of that? How do we hold on to our own individuality and critical thinking when the world's constantly trying to pull us in different directions?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think Le Bon would probably tell us to sharpen those critical thinking skills, to question everything we see and hear, to be wary of those emotional appeals that try to sidestep our rational minds. He might even suggest we step away from the crowd every now and then.
Ooh, I like that.
You know, find those spaces where we can reflect, recharge, and reconnect with our own values and beliefs.
It's about finding that balance, right? Engaging with the crowd without getting lost in it.
Exactly.
Recognizing the power of collective action, but still holding on to our own sense of agency and responsibility.
Well said.
Le Bon's work has given us so much to consider, both in understanding historical events and navigating the complexities of the world today.
I agree. The Crowd is one of those books that sticks with you.
It really is.
It challenges your assumptions, it makes you question your own behavior, and in the end, it empowers you to engage with the world in a more informed and conscious way.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the forces that shape our social world. And hey, if you're intrigued by what we've talked about today,
Definitely check it out.
grab a copy of The Crowd. You can find a link in the description.
It's a fascinating read. Even though it was written over a century ago, the insights are truly timeless.
And don't forget to subscribe to Books and Bites for more deep dives into the books that are shaping our world. We'll be back soon with another insightful exploration. Until then, happy reading.